Hello, I'm Victor Rallo Jr. We're here in New York City, the Big Apple, the biggest city in the whole world, with Axel Heinz of Ornelaia. He's the winemaker extraordinaire, excellent winemaker. And this summer I had a chance to visit with you at Ornelaia in Bolgheri, and we did some barrel samples, and it was a very hot day. And the reason I got to visit you is because harvest got called off because it was too hot, and they were harvesting later in the day, and it was a hot vintage in 2011.
Well, it was hot in a very brief amount of time. Really only the last week of August turned out to be a sort of mini heat wave that affected most parts of Tuscany. And it's true that that was one of the critical points of the vintage. But apart from these 10 days, it's actually not an exceptionally warm year. Obviously, that heat wave accelerated a couple of things and made some picking decisions quite critical. We know we grow a lot of Merlot in Bolgheri together with the other Bordeaux grape varietals. We know that Merlot does not react particularly well to heat, and so we're a little bit concerned. But you know, you always want to make sure you find the right moment, the perfect moment to pick. And obviously, in order to maintain a lot of freshness, sometimes you'd rather pick in the morning and then let things go. For the grapes and also for the pickers, obviously.
You seem to have a knack for picking at the perfect moment to make beautifully fragrant, aromatic wines that oftentimes some of the winemakers lose, and you seem to capture that in almost every vintage. And it's, I think the art of making wine in Bolgheri is that moment of time where we harvest the grapes.
I think, though, that Bolgheri is a particularly blessed place because, you know, it's Mediterranean, but it's so close to the sea, so we always have these cooling breezes that cool the climate down. Even that heat wave that we experienced in 2011 was much less pronounced in Bolgheri than it was in central Tuscany. But it's true, picking is always something where you want to get full ripeness, you want to have those soft tannins, you want to have that ripe expression of fruit, but you don't want things to be overripe. So really picking just in the right moment is something that is very important for us. It's not easy because today Ornelaia is obviously a large estate that covers more than 230 acres. And we try to really pick at the perfect moment each single vineyard block, which is not necessarily easy. In 2011 that meant picking 2/3 of our Merlots in August, where we usually just slowly start in the first days of September and then go up until the 20th or 25th of September. But yeah, you need to capture that right moment where you have where you have the ideal ripeness, but you haven't started losing the freshness.
How do you think 2011 will work out for you?
For us, it's definitely a great vintage. Some of the young vine Merlots and some of the young vines in general did suffer a little bit, but apart from that, we still, picking early, have maintained a lot of fruit, a lot of fragrance on the Merlot. And for the Cabernet Sauvignon and Cabernet Franc, I think it's really a historical vintage. It might turn out to be one of the greatest, if not the greatest vintage we've experienced at Ornelaia for those very grape varietals.
So we're here today in New York to preview the 2009 Ornelaia, and we haven't tasted it yet, so maybe you could tell us a little bit about that.
You know, you were just speaking about the importance of picking, and definitely that was the absolute key element in 2009, which was not an easy vintage, which is quite drastic vintage in the sense that it started with a quite cool and rainy, very rainy growing season, and then all of a sudden became scorchingly hot from July up until late September. So all the harvest was done under really, really, really hot temperatures, and so it was very critical really trying to pick at a moment where you were not going into overripeness. It was a quite unusual harvest just as 2011 because we picked the Merlot quite early. Usually it takes us 2 to 3 weeks to pick all the Merlot, and then it very flawlessly goes into the harvest of the Cabernet Franc, Cabernet Sauvignon. And in 2009 we really picked the Merlot in the first 10 days of September, stopped for almost 2 weeks, and then started only with the Cabernet Franc, Cabernet Sauvignon. And I have to say that 2009 is a very positive surprise because we usually, that far in the south, always afraid of the very hot vintages. We know that ripeness is what we, even in a cool year, will achieve quite easily, and when it's getting really overly warm we fear over ripeness, and we always remind 2003, which was quite a traumatic vintage for us winemakers, because we learned that really too much sun could be actually harmful for the quality of the wines. But as it turns out to be, 2009 is definitely a ripe vintage, so you'll have this not overripe but very opulent, very luscious fruit, but at the same time we were able to maintain nice fresh acidity. So 2009 is just a wonderful drinking vintage. The wines are still very young, but they're showing actually very nicely. They have a nice texture. They're not overly tannic, but they have this very refined quality of tannins. Nice and fresh acidity, which was something rather unexpected, because in a hot vintage, obviously, you would expect acidities to come down. So it's really definitely a very nice surprise.
So it's one of those ones, if we have it in our cellar, we may drink a few bottles now.
Yeah,
enjoy them
definitely.
now, and then, you know, the aging potential always of Ornelaia is always fantastic.
You know, we've always realized that even in the small vintages, the wine does hold up very well and has a very nice evolution. It's nice to have some vintages that in the youthful fruit phase already give a lot of pleasure. The structured, concentrated vintages, you will wait for them in order to have them soften down and develop all their complexity. But if you're enjoying the youthful fruit, it's nice to have a vintage like 2009, because the wines will hold, but you can also choose to uncork a bottle right away.
So we're going to go inside and we're going to drink 05, 06, 07, 08, and 09. Of those, briefly, which is your favorite vintage?
You know, it's always a tough question because you know, all of the wines you make, you obviously try to love them. Sometimes it's not necessarily the greatest vintage you love. We could speak about 2005, which in my case was my first vintage at Ornelaia. And so I have a particular feeling when I taste this wine, because I was totally new to the estate. So it's today another of these wines that is showing quite well. Not a huge vintage, but just wines that are drinking perfectly well right at the moment. Then in this lineup there are a series of really great vintages, 2006, also 2008, very dense, very concentrated wines. I have a sort of love for the 2007, which is the third in a row of three exceptional vintages with 06, 07, 08. 07 is the wine that reflects most the qualities of finesse, of freshness. It was a very seamless, sunny but cool growing season, so really very fragrant wines with a beautiful texture. Not as big probably as 2006 as 2008, still quite young wines, but a lot of satisfaction in terms of complexity, of vibrant aromatics. So it's really a vintage I love.
That's one of the vintages where you really started to have an impact in the vineyards and in the winery. It's kind of coming to your era of winemaking.
You're probably right, because it's, you know, 2005 was a difficult vintage. The first year you need to sort of understand what's going on. 06 was a great vintage, but it was a great vintage because Mother Nature wanted it.
Correct.
I didn't have the feeling that it was me. It was really the power of nature in some way, and it was very much so, because it was not an easy vintage to ferment. The vinifications were quite chaotic, and the wines turned out to be what they are because they're a gift of Mother Nature. And 2007, you're right, is probably the first where I started to get the sensation that I had things a little bit under control. But you know, in terms of winemaking, every vintage is a new challenge, so we always have to adapt yourself, and you never have the feeling that you have full control about what's happening. That's what makes it exciting too.
Well, thank you for meeting with us, and thank you for stopping by, and let's go drink some wines, and hello New York.
Hello.
Salute.